In this video, I'm going to tell you all about War of the Ring, the card game by Ares Games, and then tell you what I think of it. Hello everyone, my name is Peter and you've stumbled upon the Esoteric Order of Gamers, which is my channel, my website, all about thematic, imaginative, exciting, fun tabletop gaming, whether it's card games, board games, or tabletop miniatures games. Today I'm going to talk about the card game version of my most favourite game of all time. And if you know me in the slightest, you'll know that is War of the Ring, the amazing epic game that recreates the Lord of the Rings in tabletop form by Ares Games. Now over there I've got the collector's edition, which is the huge wooden box. It's probably my most precious gaming possession, and I've got all the supplements in the collector's forms and all the rest of it because I absolutely love that game. And if you go to this channel and do a little search, or you can go to my website and search, you'll find lots and lots of videos of me playing War of the Ring and enjoying it. It's a fantastic game and epic every time. I love it. So it was with some trepidation that I heard that there was going to be a card game called War of the Ring, the card game. What is it like? How does it play? Does it come anywhere near the exciting experience of the War of the Ring board game? Well, let's find out. But before I tell you what I think, I'm going to tell you roughly how it plays. So the core of War of the Ring, the card game, are these faction decks. And we've got a whole bunch of cards for the shadow player and a whole bunch of cards for the free people's player. And they're divided into various factions. And I've got a list of them just here in the rule book. So the shadow, here they are, they get Isengard, Monstrous, which is sort of a catch-all term for things like the Balrog and stuff, the Southrons, and Mordor. Of course, Mordor being the most important. The free peoples have more factions. They've got the Dunedain, Elf, Dwarf, Hobbit, Rohan, and Wizard. Now bear with me because there are different ways of playing this game. There's team games and there's two-player duel games and all that kind of stuff. We'll get to that in a moment, but basically you have different combinations of these different factions depending on how you play the game. You also get some large cards here, which are the location cards, and these come in two types. You have the path cards, and these are all the adventures along the way as the ring went to Mordor. And the if you know the War of the Ring board game, you'll know that that game is divided into the huge battles, and then sort of separately and concurrently you have Frodo going to Mordor trying to get rid of the ring. So this represents the path of Frodo and all those events. However, you also have two decks of battlefield cards, which are these. And these are for, of course, the Shadow and the Free Peoples. And these represent all the huge battles that took place. So, for example, at Dol Guldur and Orthanc and Minas Morgul, all the main locations where battles took place during the War of the Ring. So much like the board game, you have this concurrent thing happening. Not only are you having armies battle it out for big locations and big battle events, but you also have the journey of the ring as well, all the events that happen on the path towards the crack of doom and the disposal of the ring. Oops, spoiler! I'm assuming that you've read The Lord of the Rings by now, surely, haven't you? There's also some other extra tokens and stuff like that. So how does it play? Well, before I tell you that, let me plug my rules and reference, because of course I've done one for the game. Here are all the rules on two sides of one sheet. So you can either go through this rule book every time you want to learn the game or refresh the rules in your head, or you can just grab this. Look at that. How's that? Incredibly easy. And not only that, I've got a couple of these reference cards as well. So once you've had a look at the summary, this is basically all you need. This has got all the information about how to play a turn of the game on one side, and then on the other side there's information about the scenarios, the different ways of playing the game. Incredibly handy, so get along to my website at orderofgamers.com, search for War of the Ring, the card game. It'll be easy to find, and download the PDF, print it out. I recommend laminating it as well, trimming it to size, and then putting it in your box. And if you really enjoy it, you might want to leave me a little donation, or even better, join my Patreon channel. Now, as I said, there's a decision to be made about how you play the game first. Of course, in War of the Ring, the board game, there are just two players. You've got the good guys and the bad guys, basically. Now, the best way to play this game, and bear with me, it's a little weird, is a team game, 2 players per side. And what you do is you have these faction decks, and each player gets half of the faction deck for their side, and you get to cooperate as you play your side of the game. Alternatively, you can play with just 2 players, and you do a sort of two-hander. So you play one deck as an independent deck, and another deck as an independent deck, and you take both turns. And this is actually the best way to play the turn. And I didn't believe it at first because there's also a dual way of playing the game where you basically just chuck all the cards together and you have one deck and you play like that. And I thought, oh, that played really well, that's fine. It's only when I went back again to the two-handed team game that I realised that it's much better. It gives you much more control over the cards that come out. If all these cards are in one deck and randomly together, you don't have as much control over which cards you get and how you can play them to different battles. I'll explain that as we get into the rules. So I recommend playing, if you have just 2 players, playing the team game, but with each player controlling 2 hands. It seems weird at first, but you'll be surprised how quickly you get the hang of it and how smoothly the game plays. Now, you can also play a 3-player game, and there's also a scenario kind of thing too, where you can sort of fine-tune these decks to play particular parts of the saga of The Lord of the Rings. So, for example, in the rules, they have the Fellowship of the Ring scenario, which is basically just the first part of The Lord of the Rings. It's an unusual way of playing and certainly augurs well for the future for this game, where I'm sure they'll be bringing out other sets with different scenario setups where you can fine-tune these decks and get a different play experience. In fact, an expansion has already been announced. We'll have a quick chat about that at the end of this video. So, for the purposes of this video, let's assume we have 2 players playing a 2-hander game each. And what you do is you divide these decks up into certain faction combinations. So you'll have one hand which is made up completely of the Dunedain and the Elf decks, and that is the Aragorn player for the Free Peoples. Then you have the Frodo player for the Free Peoples, which is made up of the Dwarf, Hobbit, Rohan and Wizard cards. So you've got these 2 decks. When you get over to the Shadow side, you have the Witch King player who plays all the Shadow cards. And then you have the Saruman player who plays the Isengard, Monstrous and Southron factions. So once you've worked that out, you can start playing. So here we go into the game round. The first phase is the location step. And the first player, which will be the Frodo player to start with when you start the game, draws a battleground and a path. So if I'm over here and I'm playing the Free Peoples and I'm the Frodo player, I'm going to draw the first battleground from my battleground deck and place it on the table. In this case, it's Dol Amroth. So the first battle of the game is going to happen at Dol Amroth, way down in the south. Then I have to choose a path card. Now the path cards are broken up into 9 steps, and there's a number of cards for each step. 3, I think, is all the way through. Not sure if it's all the way through. Yes, it is. 3 cards for each step. So basically you shuffle the 3 cards for path 1, and then you shuffle the 3 cards for path 2, and you put them in an ordered pile like that. So when I draw the first path, it's going to be for path 1, and I'll put it down, and it's Buckleberry Ferry. So you can see already we have 2 cards on the board, one of which is going to be the big epic battle that's going to be happening, the other of which is the more intimate story of the Journey of the Ring. And in this case, it's the phase where they try to cross Buckleberry Ferry with the Nazgul after them. Now, at the start of the game, each player should have drawn 7 cards each as their hand. In the case of this scenario, it changes depending on the scenario. So 4, 1, 2, 3, you have cards. Now, there's an important concept in this game, and it's called cycling. And cycling basically just means taking a card from your hand and putting it face down in your discard deck. So it will come back to you later. If you eliminate a card, it gets removed from the game entirely. The thing is that every time you play a card in this game, you have to cycle another card. So your cards are not only the cards that you can play, but they're also the resource that pays for playing those cards. So in the action step, players alternate taking an action. So in this case, it would start with Frodo, then go over to one of the Shadow players, and then back to the Free Peoples, and then to the Shadow players in an order specified by the scenario. So here's what I can do in my action step. The main thing I might want to do is play a card. Now I can play it to 3 places. I can either play it to a path to try and contest a path, I can play it to a battleground to try and contest a battleground, or I can play it to a reserve area in front of me. If I play it to the reserve area, it can't be played to the battleground or path this turn. It can't move there. So usually just sort of turn it sideways to remind yourself of that. Another thing I can do is move a card from my reserve to an active path or battleground. And of course, only if I haven't played it that turn. So if I'd played a card to my reserve in a previous turn, I could then commit it to one of these central cards. I can, if I wish, just cycle a card from my hand, get rid of it, put it in my discard pile face up. I can also winnow by eliminating 2 cards to draw a new one, which is a pretty drastic thing you don't do very often because you're going to lose those cards forever. Another thing you can do is use an action on a card. A lot of the cards will have action and then something that you can do with that card. And then finally, in the type of game we're playing about, we can use our ring token. We've got one of these. And this gives us a once per game opportunity to draw another 2 cards from our deck. And once it's done, it's done. However, if you're playing the duel system, the ring is used in a different way. That's it. Players alternate doing that until all players choose consecutively to pass. Now, there are special types of cards. Of course, there are items that you can attach to particular characters, and there are event cards that you can play for one-off effects. Oh, and there's one more restriction for playing cards to paths and battlegrounds. If you play a character to a path, the number on the card has to match the step, and this may actually be a number or it may be a range of numbers. So since we're on path 1, I'm going to have 1 or 1 to 3 or whatever on this card so I can play this card to that particular path. And this is good thematically because it means you don't have situations crop up like Elrond showing up at Buckleberry Ferry and stuff like that don't fit with the course of the story. When it comes to the battlegrounds, there are shield icons on the battleground, and you can only have cards of that faction played to that battle, again for thematic reasons. Of course, it's not just thematic, it's all part of the strategy of the game. And it can be very frustrating when you've got a hand of packed full of Isengard troops and the battleground just doesn't let you go to that battleground. Okay, after the action step comes the combat step. The combat step begins with path combat, and there can only ever be 1 path card on the table at a time, though under certain circumstances you could have multiple paths come out in a single round. On the Free People's side, I've got 2 cards, Fatty Bolger and Pippin Took, and they each have 1 shield icon. On the attacking side, and the shadow is always the attacker on path cards, I've got the Hunter, who's a Nazgul, and the Barrow-wights, and they have 1 skull each. So it seems like 2 against 2. However, the path itself has got a defense icon as well, so it's actually 2 against 3. Now, for each one of these attacking skulls, the defender has to cancel out those skulls with shields. So 2 are attacking, 1 is cancelled out by the path, and one of these characters or cards has to cancel out the remaining skull. I think it's going to be poor old Fatty Bolger. Sorry, Fatty, off you go. He is eliminated from the game. So both of those skulls have been cancelled out now, and we've got Pippin Took left. So the winner of this path combat is the Fellowship side, and they will take this card and score these victory points. Now, alternatively, the Shadow player might have got a couple more Nazgul into this battle, and they have a skull each. So that's 4 versus a total of 3. Unfortunately, both of these are going to be cancelled out in that case because I have to cancel out all of those skulls. So both of these cards will be eliminated. That means there's 1 left over. 4 versus 3, there's 1 left over. So the Shadow player gets a corruption token, and this is how the Shadow player gets victory points from path cards. They don't earn this number. They only earn victory points from corruption tokens. So the Shadow wants to get lots of skulls in excess of the Free People's defense in order to get lots of victory points from corruption tokens. Battleground combat is a little more straightforward. There can be any number of battlegrounds on the table at once. Now, of course, whoever is attacking and defending, their factions have to match the symbols on the card. So in this case, we have a whole lot of Southrons attacking. They've got 3 attack symbols, and the Coastal Raiders get +1 attack symbol if they're attacking Dol Amroth. So that's 4. The location itself, because it's a Free People's location, that means the Free People's is defending. If it was a Shadow location, the Shadow player would be defending. Has a defense of 2. Strider is there, and he's got a defense of 1, so it's 3. 4 versus 3. Unfortunately, Strider has to cancel out those attacks, so he will be eliminated. Sorry, Strider. Well, these things happen. So the Shadow player gets to win this card, and it's 1 victory point. Both sides of the game score battlegrounds. You don't have to worry about corruption tokens in the case of the Shadow player. One last thing to remember, and it's very important, is that all attackers are eliminated, both on path combat and battleground combat. So after all the combat is resolved, we've got a victory check, and you calculate your score. If the difference between the two teams' scores is 10 or more, then the team with the highest score just wins. So they've got an unassailable lead. Alternatively, after combat is resolved on the last path of a scenario, which is usually path 9 if you're playing the full game, or it may be shorter if you've got a scenario of a particular type, the team with the highest score wins. On a tie, the shadow wins. And that's basically it. It's not particularly complicated. It's just getting your head around the concepts to start with. Once you get the hang of it, it flows really nice, and then you can start concentrating on all the lovely, juicy strategies. So let's talk about what I think of this game and how it plays. Well, if I was a game designer and someone came to me and said, well, here's War of the Ring, the board game, can you make it into a card game? I'd go, ah! What an epic task. I mean, this is my beautiful collector's edition of War of the Ring, which I'm very proud of. And it's a big game. There's a lot involved in it. It's a long game. It has so many cards in it that you can use in so many interesting ways to get a lot of story out. There's so much happening. I love it. But to translate that into a card game, I mean, how do you do that? The incredible thing is they've done it, because this is a great game. I absolutely love it. They've managed not only to make a really interesting, strategic, really deep card game out of The Lord of the Rings, but they've also managed to capture the atmosphere of War of the Ring. And I think that's pretty astounding. Now, there seems to have been not a huge amount of talk about War of the Ring, the card game, and I'm kind of surprised. Why? Because, well, I think people got a little bit confused by the whole idea that a team game is the best way to play, and you'd be playing as a two-handed game if you just have two players and things like that. People got a bit confused by that. They were probably just expecting a straight-up two-player game, nice and simple. However, it's surprising how important that team play game aspect is, because you don't want one big deck with all your cards in it. They're just going to get muddied. It's going to be very difficult to keep the flow of the game going and these strategies happening, which I'll try to explain, because you want the kind of control that a smaller deck will give you. And if you're controlling two decks separately, you get to synergize between them in a more interesting way. And remember, of course, that a lot of the time your cards are being eliminated. So you do get to recycle cards, put them in your discard pile, run out of the pile, reshuffle it and get into it again. But a lot of cards get eliminated, especially if they win a combat. So you have to be very, very careful about when you play cards during the game. And this is the great thing about the whole game. There are many card games which you feel like you get a hand of cards and then you just play that hand of cards. You don't feel like you're playing the whole game so much. You might be a little bit, but you feel like you're playing round after round. In this one, it is absolutely crucial that you keep an eye on the entire length of the game and what's going to happen. At the start of the game, you'll find the Free People's player has a much easier time of it. But as things go on, the Shadow player gets the advantage. And so the Shadow player has to build up their forces and bide their time until they get strong enough to really start making an impact, especially on those path cards where they need not only just enough to just beat the other player, but they need to get in excess to get as many corruption tokens as possible. Now, there's so much going on that I didn't go through in the rules, and that is, of course, there's heaps of special abilities on these cards, and they do all kinds of interesting things. There's also commanders that only have combat strength if they're played in conjunction with an army of the same faction. There are just so many decision points. It really makes this game chewy and interesting, and it's quite a long game as well, so you have plenty of time to really get into the long-term strategies of it. Another great idea is the reserve that you have in front of you. Now, because this is a game where you have to think in advance and decide when you're going to commit forces either to battlegrounds or paths, you want to put cards in your reserve so you'll be at a sufficient strength when you're ready to make that attack or defense. The other good thing about putting cards in reserve is sometimes they have special powers that only activate when they're in reserve. For example, you might play a card which gives you an extra card in your hand. This is kind of the equivalent of playing, say, Saruman in the board game and getting an extra die, which you can roll to give yourself extra actions. You can't just react to the other player in this game. You have to marshal your troops, you have to get them in reserve, you have to plan ahead, and most importantly, you have to decide which of the paths and battlegrounds you're not going to win. It's not about winning every single one. It's about deciding which ones you don't want to win, which you can afford to sacrifice, so you can save up for the ones that you really do want to win. Another interesting thing about the paths and battlegrounds is that they can be activated and reactivated. So I said in the rules summary that you activate one path and one battleground at the start of each round. However, during the round, you can decide to activate another path. And if you do that, you can only have one path in play at a time. So the previous path immediately happens as a combat. So out of turn sequence, the combat happens on that path, gets resolved, gets put aside, and then you get another path from that number or that step that you're up to. So for example, if you're on step 5 of the sequence of paths, you might activate another path. So the one that you've already got out, the combat happens, and then you get another number 5 card out. So in the case of paths, it's not just a matter of winning the path, it's winning it at the right time. And if you can get another path out, win the first one, get another one out, and win that one as well, you're really doing well. With the battlegrounds, you can have as many battlegrounds as you want happening at the same time. So you can even reactivate a battlefield that the other player has already scored. You can take it from their scoring area, and put it back on the table and fight that battle again. However, this time the defenses have already been beaten, so it won't have its own natural defenses. This keeps things so dynamic and interesting. You really have to keep track of what's going on all the time. So for example, you might be wanting to put some cards on a path, but you don't want to reveal the strength that you're going to put on that path too early. You want to wait until the other player has committed all their cards before you start committing your cards. Because remember, they're probably going to be eliminated afterwards in many cases, so you just don't want to commit cards to something that you're going to win easily. So you're watching the other player, trying to guess what they're going to do, trying to bide your time and hold back before you reveal your plans. There's so much going on. It's very cool. Now, as I mentioned, this is a long game, probably a couple of hours a game, and you really do get heavily involved in it. The great thing is, of course, there are the scenarios as well. So instead of the full trilogy scenario, which is the team game, you could play the Fellowship of the Ring scenario, and that will just give you cards that match the Fellowship of the Ring part of the book, and you can play a shorter game. But I really recommend going in for the long game because it's so involving and so deep and so tactical. When we first started sitting down to play this game, we thought, oh, we'll just play a card game, it won't take too long. Before we knew it, we were heavily involved in this long, deep game, thinking about our strategies. And every time we played it after that, it was getting deeper and deeper. And we were thinking ahead and trying to plan ahead and to decide what to do. And of course, you won't always have the right cards at the right time. It might be very, very frustrating. You need cards for a particular battlefield, but you don't have the right faction cards in hand. And you might have used all the cards from that faction in the battleground before. And so you just don't have a chance to get that battleground at all. It's all part of the rich pageant of strategy that's going on in this card game. Now, I said this game didn't get a huge amount of attention, but it must have done pretty well because they've already announced an expansion, and they say the first expansion. So I'm sure, hopefully, that means there are going to be other expansions afterwards. What they're doing in this one is giving you a solo and co-op mode. You'll be playing as the Free Peoples in solo, and they'll be replacing all of the shadow cards with a deck specially tailored for solo play and cooperative play, because you can play it cooperatively as well against the shadow. So really looking forward to that, though I must admit solo and co-op are not exciting too much for me personally, but I'm sure a lot of people will enjoy playing this solo. As it is, the thing I love about War of the Ring and the thing I love about this card game is the two-player mode and that wonderful sense of sitting down and matching wits against another player. An absolute winner, this game. I'm so impressed with it. Absolutely brilliant. And as I said, it just captures the feel of War of the Ring really, really well. You feel like you're in for a long, epic game. You feel like there's a lot of strategies and there's so many interesting decision points, and that's why the game is so good. Constant decisions to make and interesting decisions. Do I do that? Do I do that? What effect is that going to have on my total strategy? You know, how is this going to shake things up? Every time you have to make a decision, not only the very simple agonizing decision of the fact that every time you have to play a card, you have to cycle a card as well. So you can't keep all the cards that you've got in your hand because you're going to have to lose one every time you play one. Fantastic game. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this review of War of the Ring, the card game. Don't forget to check out my rules summary and reference. It's on my website at orderofgamers.com. Check out all my social media and stuff as well. Donate and join Patreon if you feel like supporting the Esoteric Order of Gamers. I'd really appreciate it. And I will see you next time. Until then, happy gaming, everyone. Bye for now.